Ho paura che si metta ancora. No, perché
So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the new installation of the Italian-Canadian Exchange, the live webinar co-hosted by Associazione Amarcord and Centro Studi Italia, Canada. I'm Gianpietro Nagliati from Associazione Amarcord. I'm here on behalf of our president, Corrado Olmi, who today has a very important commitment. His kids are playing baseball playoffs, so how can we get the parent away from his baseball playoffs? So let me please, on his behalf, on behalf of Associazione Amarcord, welcome our guest today, Marco P. Falco, who's a lawyer, an author, a friend, and a teacher. And he's a partner of Torkin Manes LLP here in Toronto, and we will be talking about the trade barriers in Canada. Our co-host is Paolo Quattrocchi, president of Centro Studi Italia, Canada, who is connecting with us from Italy. And what we are trying to do today, talking about trade barriers, is to make the difference between what the legislation, different level of legislations from Constitution itself to the most recent Bill C5 to the interprovincial agreements is about internal barriers, internal trade barriers, and where the politics of it stay, trying to stay away from the politics and just to understand the legal framework of this huge Canadian problem right now. So please, I will let Paolo do an introduction and start with the first question or the first topic with Marco. To you, Paolo.
Okay, thank you. And well, let's start from the internal barriers. I mean, a lot of people didn't know, I guess, I don't know in Canada, but for sure in Italy, not so many people knew about the interprovincial barriers in Canada. So it was something really, really new. And I knew that because, pretty familiar with the Canadian system. So I knew that there were some barriers and they were more, indirect barriers. But, and we have been talking quite a bit about this. And it seems like many of those barriers have been, canceled or provinces have been working on them. But my question is, how real is the cancellation of these barriers? How real are the MOUs or the common declarations made by different premiers from the many different regions, provinces in Canada?
It's an excellent question. First of all, grazie Gianpaolo, grazie Paolo. It's a sincere pleasure to be here today, to be part of this esteemed discussion. So, it's an excellent question. There's a few sort of general concerns and issues, and largely it's a byproduct, and Gianpietro already alluded to this, of our constitutional system, which is that we have a federal system in Canada that governs various aspects of our country. And then we have the provinces that take on other matters like contracts and so forth. And these are divided into the Constitution. So what Bill C5 does, and I think that's the first thing that we should probably touch on before we sort of get into the intra-provincial agreements that exist out there. But Bill C5 has as an aspiration the removal of federal barriers. So basically, what the federal government has said, and that is the government that ostensibly Italians would know as the government of Canada, the federal government says, look, we've got all these provinces, they all have different regulations. And then on top of that, stacked on top of that, we have national regulations that govern various issues. And there's a lot of overlap and so forth. There are some estimates that this complicated system that we've created has cost the Canadian economy somewhere upwards of $200 million, or I don't know if it's billion or million. Don't misquote me on this. So I apologize if I got the number wrong. Actually, it's billion. Sorry, $200 billion a year. So what Bill C-5 has as a sort of aspirational goal is to say, if we've got a federal requirement and we have a comparable, these are all heavy and loaded legal terms, but if we have a comparable provincial regulation, we're going to take away the federal requirement and we'll just allow the provincial one to stand. And this is based on the idea that in our Constitution, federal laws are considered generally paramount. So they usually are the ones that take over if there's conflict and so forth. And what the government of Canada has now effectively said by promulgating Bill C-5 and coming in with this new Free Trade and Labor Mobility Act in Canada is that for various goods and services across the country, the federal government will effectively step away. And if there is a provincial comparable requirement, that is the one that's going to govern. And this way, we're not going to have multiple problems as we've had throughout in the country. The issue, and I think Paolo quite rightly alludes to this, is that il diavolo si nasconde nei dettagli. And right now, the current act as it sits, and it was only passed, you can imagine that the government is acting at lightning speed in view of the economic pressures that are facing the country. But the act is effectively a very bare bones act. It's very skeletal, it's not very long, and it sort of sets out how this comparable system is going to work, where federal and provincial regulations conflict. And so there is somewhat of an effort or an aspiration, but the Canadian government still has to get together, and specifically the Prime Minister and his current cabinet have to get together and figure out what the regulations are going to say. And those are going to be the important details. That's where things like energy efficient standards, licensing requirements for various laborers across the country, trucking regulations, regulations governing the use of organic products, all of those things will be dealt with specifically in the regulations. So right now, we don't have a clear understanding yet of what the framework is going to look like, as Paolo said, as applied to specific industries and services and goods across the country. It's still very much an up in the air question. We do know that it won't apply to certain things like our dairy industry. You know, the dairy products are very specifically regulated in Canada. It won't apply, as I understand it, to things like the Quebec language laws, which require various items and services to be given or labeled in French. And it won't apply to things like credit unions, which are effectively smaller banks within Canada itself. But I do agree with Paolo. It's a sort of, we have to wait and see moment right now to see once lawyers get their teeth into the actual regulations. And you can imagine there's going to be a lot of litigation also about what constitutes a comparable federal and provincial regulation or requirement. There's going to be a lot of debate, I suspect, and a lot of litigation around those terms.
Yes, but Marco, sorry if I mean, as a journalist by trade, I have some doubts that leaving the provinces to deal with their own regulations between each other or so, and taking away that the federal government will facilitate the process of taking down barriers, because in the end, usually there were the provinces who used these kind of barriers to protect somehow some businesses or trades or products or so? Couldn't there a problem exactly because we are not so sure of what exactly the province wants for itself.
Right, and I think that's. Sorry, Paolo, you go ahead.
No, right. I'm saying right to what just Giampiero said.
Yeah, and I understand the concern. I mean, I'm not here to sort of defend the Canadian federalist system. It has worked, these many years, and but we do have, and I think Giampiero alludes to a very good point, which is we have a very particular system, and that means that for things that are not governed by the federal government, which is a lot in terms of industry in Canada, it's up to the individual provinces to now start negotiating intra-provincial agreements. And, some provinces have more incentive to do this than others, though I would argue in this current economic state that we find ourselves, I think most provinces are largely on board in terms of wanting to get together and negotiate. So, by way of example, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business in 2025 issued a sort of report card on how willing various provinces were to start eliminating these trade barriers that we have vis-a-vis each other. And Nova Scotia actually ranked the highest, and I think Ontario came second in terms of entering into, if you can believe it, within the country of Canada, effectively free trade agreements governing various industries. So by way of example, Ontario has a lot of incentive to do this. We are the largest economy in the country. We are the economic engine of Canada. So the Ontario government just recently announced, and I think it was last week, we've signed 10 agreements across the country with provinces and territories for various regulated professions across the country. And this will allow certain workers in various regulated professions to essentially work in another province. I think it's for an initial period of 6 months until they're waiting for that provincial regulator to essentially authorize them to practice in that area. And that's going to apply to a whole range of professions. But to your point, this is the nature of Canadian federalism, which is we were a bunch of provinces who in 1867 and onward decided to come together, but we were very much independent units. I don't need to explain this to Italians.
No, but I know how Canada was born. I perfectly know that. But my let's say my concern nowadays is that it has been many things have been said in the last few months about the cancellation of the barriers. But as far as you say, it seems like that it's a long process. I mean, in the last few weeks, I haven't heard anything about, interprovincial barriers, but it seems like that it's not going to be something that will take place in, let's say, 3 or 6 months. It will take much more than that. I mean, we might wait a couple of years maybe before something happens. That's my guess. It's a guess, of course, but I'm living over here, 7,000 kilometers away, and I'm asking you. I mean, do you have a forecast? I mean, there is a type of guess that can be done in relation to the abolition of the interprovincial barriers?
I think it's a very valid point. I can't speak to timing specifically in the sense that I don't know what's going to happen vis-a-vis various industries. But if we take what Paolo has actually said and think about how it's going to work mechanically, if we take something like Bill C5, regulations between the Prime Minister and Cabinet can get out pretty quickly. And they can come into force relatively quickly. There's going to be knots and problems without question. Small issues will continue to arise as each province tries to navigate this, and even vis-a-vis these intra-provincial agreements. But as I said, I think Paolo's addressing a concern that there's a lot of politicians out there talking about dismantling the barriers, but when is it actually going to happen? And I mean, I can't give you an exact time frame. That being said, I think you raise a valid point, but I also do have faith in our system, which is that when we pass laws in the country that require legislative approval, so something like this brand new Free Trade and Labor Mobility Act, that has to go to Parliament. Everyone's got to vote on board. And, again, I don't need to explain to Italians what a complicated process that is. But when we're actually talking about the sort of meat of what's going to be done with various industries, like, energy efficiency standards and so forth, that can get off the ground. You'd be shocked much more quickly in our democratic system than you would imagine. And that's only because it effectively requires a meeting of the Prime Minister and Cabinet to promulgate a bunch of regulations. And then once those regulations go into force, we're full steam ahead in Canada. So in terms of a time frame, I take Paolo's point entirely, whether it's, a couple of months, whether it's a couple of years. But I think there is a political impetus right now for politicians to say, we need to get this off the ground, and we're not going to let various things stand in our way. And if that means, slotting a lot of legislation through regulation, because that doesn't require legislative approval and voting, we may do it that way. I mean, there are anti-democratic concerns about that, of course. But and there's also, Canada is specific in that, and I'm sure you've seen this in the media, we also have a legal obligation to consult with our Indigenous First Nations persons for various projects across the country. So there will be barriers and there will be constitutional challenges on those grounds as well, because we're dismantling a system where, effectively in 1867, Indigenous and First Nations people were not consulted at all. And now we have a positive duty to consult. That's enshrined in Canadian common law by the Supreme Court of Canada. So how quickly that all gets off the ground, how quickly it could be stopped by the judicial process and by various challenges remains to be seen. That said, I think Canadians, given the current state of the economy, are going to want to see more action than words.
But let's say that can we say that the federal government did what he was expecting to do, and now is more a matter of the each provinces and territories? Can we say that the federal government, what they could do, they did? Now it depends on provinces. Is that
yes
correct?
No. So the federal government still hasn't told us what's in those regulations. So they have to still lift their quote unquote internal trade barriers, whatever those may be. So when those regulations come out, don't quote me on this, I thought that there was some suspicion that it would be towards the end of 2025. So the federal government's, has passed Bill C-65. It came into force, I believe, on June 26th. But there's still going to be a requirement that we see what the regulations look like. So that the federal government isn't off the hook quite yet. In fact, I think the fund is only beginning now. Then, layered on top of that, Paolo, and you raise a valid point, the provinces now have to get together and arrange and discuss all of these agreements. And they're doing that. But this is the messiness of federalism, which is that, agreements are happening left, right, and center, and all governments are going at it. And we're trying to, dismantle this entire system that we've created over 100 plus years. And so that will take some time. But that being said, if you can think about it this way, we've got a federal stream and the intra-provincial stream, and they're both moving at the same time.
Okay. Well, that's something that is it's really important, and it's weird though how this type of thing, let's call it like that, haven't been taken into consideration for, let's say, 150 years. But I mean, in some sense, I guess that the Trump storm. I know that this is something that maybe Canadians don't like to hear about, but I guess that the Canadian storm, the Trump storm, is something that will positively affect Canada. At the end of the day, in 3-5 years, this is something that will make Canada much stronger than before.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the Canadian government is fully committed to diversification, which is probably the theme that Paolo is hitting. I mean, as far as I understand it, America is our biggest customer, but our government is currently running around, and we know that one of the first places that he hit was the European Union. We are looking for agreements everywhere at this point to sort of stabilize our economy. And to your point, Paolo, and I alluded to this earlier, but these interprovincial barriers that we created, and there were some very noble reasons why we have these barriers. I mean, there's the language protection laws in Quebec. There's public health and safety requirements that we want to make sure people are not dying from environmental contamination and all that. But we created this system, and the process of dismantling it will hopefully bring our economy the 200 billion that we needed. And you're right, Paolo, in the sense that this was in the back of Canadians' minds for decades. The baby boomers lived through it, and everyone kind of parked it on the back burner. It wasn't pressing because our economy was chugging along, and then we were relying on our number one customer across the border. That is no longer something we can rely on, as our government has made clear. And so this has, to your point, put right to the forefront the primary issue of why do we have all of these barriers, some of which are ridiculous, when we are governing as an entire country and we present ourselves to the world as one nation.
But once again, if I may, because your dialogue is so interesting that I feel almost ashamed in interrupting. But no, Marco and Paolo, from your perception and knowledge of Canada or so. But how is it that we can go forward with these kind of things through regulations? Because usually these regulations will change, will have a big impact on the life of many Canadians. Especially we are thinking not to the big infrastructure projects, but if we think about the regulations for professions, for trades, for trucks, and so on. And usually regulations are... Okay, don't quote me on this, but less democratic than legislation because they're much more. So, is there some? Should we be concerned about the process we are going through to bring these barriers down? Is it? Do you think, Marco, that the citizenship, the Canadians, are understanding what the government wants to do and the impact that this can have? Positive or negative, both of them?
I think it's a valid question, and I have no doubt that some of the regulations that are promulgated will eventually get challenged. But I mean, that's the job of lawyers and judges and courts, right? To make sure that within our constitutional structure, those regulations that are passed, in fact, pass muster under our Constitution, under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So there's definitely there will be a check and balance system, and fortunately, much like Italy, we're fortunate to live in a democratic country where the judiciary will be keeping an eye on those sorts of concerns. That being said, our entire system has always been based on an act being passed by the federal legislature, and then having a series, or provincial legislature for that matter, and then having a series of regulations that are developed by what we call promulgation by cabinet. That's not unusual. So I don't know. I don't want to sort of overestimate the effect. There might be, if there are any sort of anti-democratic tendencies, those will be dealt with in court without question. There will be lawyers who will challenge them as required, and then our judiciary will comment on whether or not they need constitutional scrutiny. But separate and apart from that, Gianpietro, it's an excellent question. I just don't see it as a fundamental cause for major concern, just because it is how our system has operated to date. And it's the system that we inherited, of course, from Westminster in the UK, right? Which is, you have a statute and then you have a series of regulations behind them, and the regulations are the responsibility of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, or of the Premier of a province and their cabinet.
And my other question would be this, Marco. When we talk about interprovincial agreements, quite often we see agreements involving 2 or 3 provinces, like Ontario signed a number of them, as you were mentioning. But as an example, to have an energy agreement with Alberta, I don't know, to build a pipeline from Alberta to Ontario without involving Manitoba or Saskatchewan doesn't sound such a so
plausible. No, it's not a plausibility. And I mean, that's the sort of nature of our federal structure as well, because you would imagine that if it does involve intra-provincial trade, under sections 91 and 92 of our Constitution Act from 1867, I imagine the federal government has some paramountcy powers there, and they're not going to relinquish those. So, to take your hypothetical to Edmonton, Alberta, I do not envision a circumstance in which the federal government is sort of hands off at that point. Our system of federalism isn't so narrow-minded that it's a completely hands-off federal government that only handles things like immigration and criminal law. Our government dies and doctrines under our Constitution to effectively get involved where needed. And to your point, that would be a prime example, in my view, of an example where the federal government would have to exercise its sort of paramountcy power within the federation.
And also another question: is there a risk the provinces might agree on different regulations? So let's say that something that is okay and it's agreed upon by, I don't know, Ontario and Quebec, but then Alberta, Manitoba on the same topic have a different agreement and agree to do things differently. Is that a factor that can happen in our system? Because it would add some problems or confusion. I don't know. I'm just trying to understand this.
No, 100% the potential conflicts, right? And this is how we sort of ended up in this situation to begin with each province having its own sort of systems that govern energy efficiency, by way of example, because each province wanted to go at it at a different way. This is clearly within the sphere of the province's powers itself, and so they developed them. And there is the potential for conflict there. From a legal perspective, the way to address that conflict is by way of challenges. You can take things to court under sections 91 and 92. And then there's the political aspect. These days, and again, I don't, Gianpietro said to sort of stay clear of the political sort of element here, but and I don't intend to wade into those waters. But I think on the whole, most provinces right now, they're sort of looking down the road, and the huge seismic impact of what's happened in the United States and its relationship to Canada, that they have no alternative but to want to cooperate. So to the extent that conflict can be minimized at a political level, I do fundamentally believe that the will is there. How those things get resolved is through the process of negotiation between the provinces, right? And again, I'm not a political theorist perspective. To the extent that things run afoul in an intra-provincial agreement, you can imagine that one of the superior courts in the provinces is going to hear a challenge to it, whether it's, to Gianpietro's point, some type of conflict in the terms or provisions of the agreement, whether it runs afoul of the Constitution, the Constitution Act, or the Charter. Those are ways that in which they would fundamentally be challenged in a court of law, and that's how you would address those conflicts. It's an excellent question.
I have another question for the both of you, because I think it might be somehow interesting for our viewers. So Canada is a single country, a single nation, with a single parliament, a single prime minister, and so on, but it seems to have so many trade barriers. European Union, some say that we don't even know who really governs the European Union, but besides, no, my question is this. It looks like there are less barriers between countries in Europe than there are between provinces in Canada somehow. I would like to have your feedback on this and also what should be done. Does Canada need to look a little bit more as the European Union, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I'm going to deflect to Paolo on the European Union piece. I don't know if Paolo has any thoughts on that. It's an excellent question.
But he has his microphone is.
Oh, Paolo, I think you're on mute.
Paolo, you are on mute.
Nope.
You are on mute, Paolo.
No,
Maybe
I don't think.
No, you're fine now.
I don't think I'm mute now.
No,
I mean,
you're perfect.
Yeah, no. The question is that we do have in Europe barriers. I mean, it just it's a different scenario, of course, but the situation can be better also in Europe. And what we are trying to do in Europe nowadays is to cut off, let's say, all the barriers we have. But as Mark said before, I mean, it's a matter of the Canada is a confederation. And a confederation is something different from a union. Of course, Canada is one country with 13, let's say, called all of them provinces, and but it's still a confederation. And being a confederation has its own positive things and negative things. And but Europe is a union, but we have also some barriers between states. And the matter of the fact is that at the end of the day, Europe, that's my concern about the EU, is that we say that we are united, let's say, but we have a very strong competition among states. I mean, it's not that easy. The European Union, of course, is one body, but it's one body for many things, but not for many other policy, which is something that makes Canada, one country. We don't have one foreign policy, and we compete each other on the international scenario, as well as on the international trade. Of course, each province is considering, the specific positions, such as, BC looks at Asia and Quebec looks at Europe. but in Europe, we are fighting against each other on the international trade scenario. I mean, it's just, if you think about Spain, France, Italy, and Greece, I mean, there are so many products where we compete really strongly. I mean, so it's not, not everything that is shining is so nice. I mean, Europe seems united. We have one currency, fine, of course, but we don't have the same fiscal system. While in Canada, with all the differences between provinces, the fiscal system, it's very similar to each other. We have islands of free tax in Europe, while you don't have them at all in Canada.
I think Paolo hit some really excellent points, and that fundamental distinction between a confederation and a union, I think, is material, because it also means that we're going at the problem differently. We have very Canadian solutions to these interprovincial trade barriers, and I alluded to it earlier. But again, we have to take into consideration under our confederation that we have a duty to consult with Indigenous and First Nations persons when we engage in projects. We have the French language that requires protection, and all the language laws that are associated with that. And then Gianpietro alluded to this earlier. Provinces have different priorities. We might be using sort of resources and environmental and energy projects that will have a significantly better impact on the environment, and other provinces may not agree with that. So I think what will come of this, and Paolo kind of alluded to this earlier, is that in 2 to 3 years' time, we'll probably look back at this as a leading period in our history. But it's going to be one in which I think we're going to have, and that is, after years of litigation and so forth, and dealing with the legal and economic and political aspects of the problems that we now face as a country as a consequence of what's happened south of the border. I think that we are going to come out of this with a very Canadian way of doing things, which will involve things like consulting our Indigenous persons and making sure people within the country itself and that population.
So that would be like partially cloudy. Can we say that?
Bravo. Very well put.
Partially cloudy. It's not cloudy yet, but one is that Canada has a huge opportunity to, I wouldn't say rebuild, because there's nothing to rebuild, but to refurbish, to change paths. And I'm always thinking that I don't know how much Canadians know that they are a huge country. Huge, not in terms of areas or size, but huge in terms of opportunity. And must be done is put things together, because also this talking about secession about provinces, it's really unfair and useless. I would say much worse than useless. Of course, there are a lot of things to do.
I tend to agree. Oh, sorry,
I was on mute. Sorry, I was asking because both of you mentioned the connection between the situation we are in and what is happening south of the border. But we will have to review our legislative framework even towards south of the border, I guess, through the renegotiation of USMA, if there will be. My question is there a connection, will there be a connection in the changes that we'll be making to our internal trade and those that we might consider toward south of the border? So the two things are connected somehow.
Well, you know what? I'm Italian, and I don't know. I think that the occasion for taking into consideration some changes, of course, came out from what is happening south of the border. But I mean, I guess that you know, I don't want to give any judgment about, but it seems like that after the 10 years, you know, after this and the leaving of Mr. Trudeau, I mean, it was a sign that something has to be changed, and it seems like something is changing. It's a matter of organizing, but of course, the connection between Canada and what happens south of the border is it's clear in my perception.
100%, and I think you both alluded to this theme, right? I think since World War II, this is probably the biggest nation-building project we've had to engage in. Like I said, I have a strong suspicion we're going to look back at this period of time, you know, 5 years out from now, and realize how important it very much has to come together, you know, and sort of engage in this nation-building project. I'm the son of an Italian immigrant, or as the son of Italian immigrants, and I know very well what they're coming here and trying to rebuild their lives here in following the war. And I think we're very much at that sort of inflection point again. It's just not as apparent and obvious because it doesn't involve necessarily physical things like, you know, mass immigration, at least not yet, and so forth, and to talk about. But I do recognize the importance of this moment in history, and I think our current government recognizes that as well, or our federal government, and understands that we have to do our best at this particular point to revisit the structure of confederation and not simply take things for granted.
This goes a little bit perhaps over our topic, but Marco, you mentioned the structure of confederation. When you take into consideration the structure of something, there is always even a small risk that it could break. Do you see, should we be worried about not interprovincial trade barriers, but torsions that the structure of confederation might not be able to support?
I'm with Paolo on this. I think there's some fringe movements that, you know, would like to see the country fall apart. I don't particularly subscribe to any of those. I think Canada is quite strong. The secession movement that I've been dealing with, you know, as a Canadian my entire life since my high school years was Quebec. The French language movement. It seems that since what's happened at the border has unified the country, at least for now, inside it, if anything, we seem to be much more united as a country. There will be movements. I still relegate those, you know, to the fringes. I think, you know, with any good fortune, if we do things right in the next 3 to 5 years, we will come out a stronger country. I'm hoping.
Yeah,
I sincerely am, because I think we're a beacon to the world. I think, Italy is too. There's no question about that. But I think the European Union and the countries there and the democracies in Canada, Australia, and so forth are sort of going to lead the way in becoming stronger countries.
You know what?
I'm optimistic.
I totally agree with you about Canada. I totally agree with you. I mean, secessions are colorful ideas, and there might be people who like them, but I don't think that they are really actual. That's my perception, at least my perception. And then it's also, from a constitutional point of view, as far as I know, it's very, very complicated. I mean, after the referendum in Quebec in the 90s, I mean, things changed, and I think that secession in Canada is absolutely complicated. I wouldn't be as optimistic as you are about the EU, because you know what, at the end of the day, Canada is one country. You have two languages, of course. You have your history, which is quite fascinating for me, but you are one people, let's say, and you have been together for hundreds of years, and you might be fighting, let's say, in a broad sense, but you are one country. We can't forget, unfortunately, in Europe that we have been fighting for centuries before, learning the lesson and try to do things together. But, the difference between Portugal,
it's a valid point.
Poland, Greek, what I always think is that the language, it's fundamental. And I say just two languages, while we have 27 languages, 27 different histories, and we still have controversial borders. Because, in Western Europe, we don't have controversial borders because, we stopped fighting maybe a couple of hundred years ago, and so things are gone. But if you think about East Europe, there are many, and Balkans, which are not EU, but they are still in Europe. There are many complicated situations to deal with. So I'm quite optimistic with Canada, and what Marco is saying is really makes me come there's something to do. That's the starting point. Once you get to the point that something must be changed, and somehow it will be changed, and so the path will be more smooth rather than what we have in Europe. That's my perception.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think Paolo sort of alludes to the differences. What I'm hoping is that, remember that Canada inherited most of its legal system and constitutional structure from Europe. So I'm hoping we all continue to learn from each other in that respect.
So this is I'm using this banner because I almost would like it's one last question. We're almost 10 minutes away or less from the end of this webinar. But I would like to ask you this, Marco, because I read a couple of the agreements that were signed between provinces, and they did have this small clause that says that they are not legally binding. So what happens next? Because either we imagine that these agreements are just words, or there must be following steps to bring them into something that works, something that is legislated.
Right, and I think that's right, Gianpietro. We probably I haven't had a moment, so I'm sort of speculating on this. I haven't had a moment to actually look at these specific agreements themselves. But all of that said, presumably at some point, the way that those things become enforceable is they have to be incorporated within provincial law, and that's how you get enforcement. It's comparable to an international treaty between two different countries. You enter into the treaty has no force in Canada until the Canadian government actually makes it a law in Canada. recommendations, guidelines, and non-binding. I suspect, and that's a principle of private international law that we've governed ourselves with in Canada for over a century. So I suspect the same sort of rubric, or at least legal understanding, would apply. And that is that if two provinces enter into an agreement, until each province goes back, promulgates the necessary regulation, or alternatively takes the statute and creates a statute and passes it through the legislature. And it's at that particular point that it becomes provincial law. And that's when it would have the binding value of it. But it's an excellent question. These are almost, I do a lot of contract law. A lot of them are probably sitting there right now as agreements to agree, and they don't become actual agreements until they become law in the province to which they apply.
Even because I think that they should probably look for some kind of harmonization, because it wouldn't make so much sense into the perspective if Ontario and Manitoba do an agreement on something, and then Ontario does a different agreement on the same thing with, I don't know, Saskatchewan. The
right.
problem wouldn't be solved.
There may be a little bit of inconsistency there, but you had asked that question earlier, and it's a very valid point. But I think there very much may be some conflicts, and Ontario may have two different agreements that govern, I don't know, land surveyors and how we regulate them with Quebec than we would with Saskatchewan. Adding in, and I think that's also a necessity again of our constitutional structure, because in a province like Quebec, you would have language requirements on top of everything, right? So yeah, it's a valid point, but I think this is the sort of stickiness of federalism that we deal with regularly.
Paolo, what is your take on this? You are mute. You are mute.
Am I mute?
No,
Sorry,
no, it's okay.
Giampiero, I didn't hear you. Hello?
No, I mean, I was asking what your take is on this. I was asking Paolo. Yes, we hear you. Can you hear us? So I was asking your take about this and about the idea that the provinces need to be all in agreement to go forward toward bringing down the trade barriers.
Of course, I mean, directions. I mean, that's of course it's a need. In my book about Canada, I said that Canada is a laboratory of the future, and it seems like it's even still true. I mean, there's a lot of things to do. I don't know. Before I was talking about the two languages, but actually Canada has three languages. All the Nunavut creation, legislation up there with the mine rights and everything. So there's a lot of things to do. I mean, it's a starting point. It's a restarting point. I mean, and in my perception, with the level of and the capability of the organization that Canadians always prove to have, we succeeded.
Marco, do you agree? Will we find a solution out of this very complex and also somehow intorcinati, let's use the Italian word, problem for legislation, regulations, and so and we will be able to restart our engine?
I sincerely hope so. Falco seems to be a great champion of Canada, and for our sake. But I tend to be optimistic about this too. I think there will be significant challenges down the road, and our Prime Minister has been out there sort of preparing Canadians. There will be significant challenges without question. But when we're talking about $200 billion in intra-provincial trade, that's a lot. And so I'm optimistic that if we can take down 85% of those barriers, we'll be in better stead than we ever were prior to this situation.
One last comment before we are closing for sure.
I can't hear you. Could you repeat, please?
Paolo, one last comment to close this webinar, because we are approaching 12:30, and Marco, we all have families and so.
Oh, a last comment, you mean? Well, you know what? I agree with Marco. It's a very challenging situation. I don't know. I honestly don't know how much Canadians understand that it is so challenging. You have to listen to him very carefully, because he says everything, but in a way that the politicians say things. But it's a very challenging situation, stronger, with a self-consciousness much stronger than before. I mean, that's my hope. But the country is so rich, it's so strong, the base are so strong that it's rich country in terms of natural resources can slow down. I mean, it can be a tough moment. Might be, as Mark said, maybe 2, 3, 4 years, but it has to go up again. I mean, the link with the US has always been something, having a big guy down the border, and now you know what, you can have a big guy down the border, but dealing with him from a different perspective.
Marco. No, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I agree completely with Paolo. I think he sort of hit the nail on the head. Our first Trudeau Prime Minister, Pierre, once said that when the Americans cough, we get influenza and die, or something to that effect. I'm misquoting it now. I think this is a moment to get away from that type of dependence. And I think discussions like these and broader discussions will put Canada in better stead in terms of taking down those interprovincial barriers that have, ruined our economy in some respect over the past few decades.
Okay, so I thank you, Marco and Paolo, for their for their time, and for most important, for their ideas and thoughts and words that they shared with us. Our next webinar with the Associazione Amarcord will be on next Saturday, when we will have guests to talk about Emilia-Romagna and Canada and the relationship that we're having. And for now, thank you very much. Grazie Marco. Grazie Paolo. Buon weekend, and I hope there will be other opportunities.
Certo. Buon weekend.
Ciao, grazie. Thank you very much.